Hi everyone, Comic Reviewer here, and this time reviewing on Superman, issue 407. Now, as you know, this series is meant to take place in the pre-Crisis DC Universe series. That was the original timeline before Crisis on the Infinite Earths. Now, the cover pretty much has Lois Lane, Jimmy Olsen, and Perry White flying around with Superman's powers, while Superman looks baffled. And the story starts off how basically Mr. Mxyzptlk, who is a character from the fifth dimension, who plans to play his next prank on Superman, saying, "But what that Buttwink doesn't know is that he's about to be the butt of my latest joke." So Superman sees that an earthquake is happening, and as soon as Mr. Mxyzptlk says, "There's for a little magic," and plans to basically put a spell on him where basically anytime someone touches him, they gain his powers. So Superman manages to put the collapsing building back in place, the tracks, and goes deeper underground, which turns out it's a giant rockworm, where Superman goes to try and take it down, with Mr. Mxyzptlk saying, "Oh, all together, hand, who can resist? That's what I call a holy moly." And so Superman tries to take it down, to little to no success, and manages to take off one of the drills. And Superman saying, "I haven't wanted to use my full powers against something that's looking like a dumb animal, but I've got to get free." And so tries to take it down, but has little to no success, which ends up with Superman flying up into the air, where Jimmy Olsen sees him and asks him about the story, where Superman sees that he's going to fall, but saves him just in time, where Superman explains that it's a giant rockworm, and Olsen's like, "Come on, what's the scoop? Lex Luthor? Brainiac?" And so he points out that it's a giant worm, and that he suddenly feels weak. Which turns out that since Jimmy Olsen touched him, he now has his powers, which ends up with him doing a snooper sneeze that ends up putting out the fire, and ends up with him breaking his camera. So Superman doesn't have the full sets of his powers. That makes him a bit more of an easier target, but manages to outwit the giant alien worm, which Olsen saves him. And at first they believe that it's the alien worm that may have caused him to lose some of his powers, so they go to a professor at Star Labs who may know the key and who's a friend of Perry White. So Superman shows up with Jimmy Olsen, and pretty much the scientist is like saying, "It isn't a worm, precisely. It's a Veruworm, about 3 inches long. Then it's not the huge creature I've just fought, unless..." And so Lois Lane asks about the worm, which he points out that he did it to kind of improve mining jobs, and how people were lost because of it, even his own father, which Superman believes that his alien worm did escape, and that he's going to try and stop it. So as soon as Jimmy Olsen and Perry White do a bit of arm wrestling, it ends up with Perry White getting Superman's powers as well. And they might believe that, yeah, since Jimmy Olsen lost his powers, meaning that Superman's got them back, which they find out to their dismay that Perry White now has them, and that they're now knowing that Superman's going to be easily killed, despite it. And this ends up with Superman going back to confront the worm, which ends up with him basically using some of his powers, but finds out he's dislocated his shoulder, and that he has to try and take down the worm with different maneuvers. And Superman basically says, "Missed, again, strike 2, strike 3, and says, "You're out." And so Mxyzptlk sees that the ceiling is coming down, and that, yeah, since Superman doesn't have his full super hearing, he can't really save himself. And says, "You big dumb banana, look out! Mxyzptlk, you're the one who stole my powers!" And so, basically, he gets caved in, with Mxyzptlk realizing that if he dies, he can't have anyone to fool around with, so has to do the most reasonable thing, go to Jimmy Olsen, Perry White, and Lois, which turns out Perry White is having a hard time getting adapted to these powers. And as soon as Lois Lane touches Perry White, she ends up with Superman's powers, and as soon as they see Mr. Mxyzptlk and explain that he needs their help, Lois Lane finds out she has flight, and even Perry White asks, like, "Where's Clark been today?" Which ends up with the alien worm basically confronting Superman. And suddenly, yeah, everyone starts throwing boulders, and basically Superman getting his powers back thanks to Mxyzptlk, and ties up the worm single-handedly, which ends up with Superman basically throwing him into space and into Halley's Comet, where he'll eat for all eternity. And yeah, the story ends off with Superman basically sealing up the cracks and fissures, and that basically Lois and that point out that they should get rid of Mr. Mxyzptlk, which Superman manages to trick him into saying his name backwards, which causes him to fade from existence. Until next time. And yeah, this is the story. So issue 407 isn't too bad. It's a simple Mxyzptlk story, and yeah, it's nothing special. It's a regular issue, but definitely alright. So I think it deserves a thumbs up. Still good, and still alright. So, Comic Reviewer here, signing out.